To give you an idea of the scope of security settings that you can use for TechWeb, we're back in the Alarm program here, and under TechWeb system settings, there's actually two areas that you can set up TechWeb. The first area has to do with overall settings. You've entered your company name and phone number, and then the web address that is associated with TechWeb that's installed on your server, and also the port number, which will determine where TechWeb runs on your server. And under general settings, this section here lets you customize how many rows of records will be displayed on a list before it goes to the next page. So for example, if you have a smaller device that maybe can't accept 25 lines, you can specify 20 lines. So this way you have the ability to make the TechWeb look like it's a page-by-page application rather than having to scroll. By the same token, you may want to have a lot of records and you don't mind using your finger and scrolling up and down a long list. For example, on the Rolodex, you may have 100 records and you don't care that you want to use your finger to scroll up and down that list rather than hitting next and previous. So this gives you the ability to customize all the main lists in TechWeb to how long they're going to be displayed until you get to the next and previous buttons. Under email settings, this is where you enter what your email information is, your email account on your server back in the office. That's where all the emails are sent out from TechWeb. So just like in Alarm where you have email settings, you want to enter them here. In fact, when you set up TechWeb, it initially will draw those values from your Alarm email settings into the TechWeb settings, but you can override it if you wish to. When you go to create a purchase order in TechWeb and you want to email it out to the vendors, you can specify what appears the body of the email here. And then for your service tickets, if you had seen the previous video on how to override or have your labor and materials calculated for you on a work order, you can specify here whether or not there's going to be tax on those items. So you can say yes or no for if you tax on labor and if you tax on materials. Since TechWeb will be used by employees at all different levels, there is a comprehensive security section built in. Let's go ahead and bring up one of these users. And you would create their ID and password. And for each main section of TechWeb under the main menu, you will see a tab representing each of those screens. So let's start with the customer area. You can select yes if you allow this user to access the customer main screen, and then you can also determine, as you'll see throughout the security area, whether or not this user has the ability to add, modify, or delete records in that section. If you want this user, for example, to be able to view customers only but not change or add any customers, then just remove the check boxes from this section. Otherwise, keep it checked and they'll be able to add customers as well as modify and delete. Within the customer area, if you have Multicom installed in Alarm, which is a separate option for Alarm that allows you to track customers by branch or by company, that if you have multiple companies that you own, you can indicate that this user, when they log in, can only look at customer records and service tickets and so forth that are associated with a particular company code. So for example, if you have two branches and you want the employees at one branch or workers from one branch to be able to only access customers that relate to that branch, if you have Multicom installed, TechWeb takes advantage of that Multicom feature. Within the customer screen, there are sub-menu sections. That's where you would access their contract list, recurring charges, any documents, the emergency contact list, zone list, and so forth. For every single one of those sections, the sub-menus, you can decide if this user will be able to have access to that area, and if so, what their restrictions will be as to what they can perform in that area. And then the bottom of this customer tab, there is a place where you can specify certain columns that you want to display on the customer list. This is really important because if you've got a mobile device that only has a certain width to the screen, if you have too many columns shown on that customer list, you're going to have the customer name wrap around. So basically each customer record will take up 2 lines on the screen, which gives you basically half the number of customers you can see at one time on the screen on the customer list. So you may not need all the various columns, so you can determine here which of these 4 columns are important to show. There are certain columns that will by default always be shown in the customer list. The customer name, for example, their account number. But you can also determine if you want the central station account number to show or not, the contact name, the town, or their first name, and any combination of these. The more you have, the wider the list will be. Those columns that you have selected here, not only will you see that column displayed on the customer list, but you will also be able to sort by that column, and you can do a search by that column. So if you select customer contact name as yes, customer list will show the contact name column, and you can click on that column and do a search by customer by their contact name. And it is what's called a contains search, meaning that you can enter any part of letters and it will find all customers whose contact name contains those letters. Whether it begins or ends, it doesn't matter. If it's in that part of the name, it will find it for you. And then you can determine security settings in the service ticket area, including if this user can only have access to their own service tickets or not, the various tabs that are displayed on a service ticket, and just like with customers, you can determine a couple of columns that you can hide or display on the service ticket list. Under inventory, you have the ability to specify what areas of inventory this user can access and if they can add, modify, delete in various sections, as you can see here. The highlights in this area would be whether or not that they can access the main inventory and if they can access stock in other locations, and specifically if you want to lock them in to only looking at inventory at a specific location. So if a technician, for example, has a truck and you want the technician to only access inventory from that truck, then you can specify that here, and when they go to the inventory section, they will only be able to view items that are in that truck and no other location. You can also specify if this user can create purchase orders and if they have access to the details of a purchase order or not. Also in here, you determine whether or not this user should ever be able to see pricing on inventory. There's some situations where you may have a user that you do not want them to see pricing in inventory at all. So you can specify here that they're not allowed to see inventory pricing and that they're not allowed to see cost factors as well, one or the other or both. For the appointment calendar, not only can you restrict access to that, but also you can determine if the appointments being shown on the calendar should only be those belonging to this user. And then again, there are certain columns you can determine if you want displayed on the appointment calendar list or not. Under miscellaneous, it would be the Rolodex section, and just like an alarm, you can restrict this user to adding and looking at Rolodex items that are just ones they've entered themselves personally, not a global list of all Rolodex items. And then in the support list area, you can determine the same thing, whether or not this person can only see support records that are tagged with their user ID. And the last tab is email, where you just specify what your email address, this particular user's email address is, and whether or not they want a copy of an invoice or a copy of a PO that they create or email out. In the case of POs, you can create them. Invoices, you can just email them. But if you want a copy sent to the user's own email address as well.